What's up, everybody? Back here with another team talk. Excuse me if I'm not so excited because my back really hurts right now. This stool I'm sitting on is a pile of crap for what I need. But what we're here to talk about today is a brand battle. Brand battle between OMC and Mercury. We're going to start in the 80s and we're going to go right through the 90s, just before 2000. And we're going to talk about the battle that those two major brands at the time were doing. How the technology was coming around, my opinion only, not anyone else's, because no one else wanted to stay except for this Baja. But we're gonna just take my opinion because I worked on all the stuff and it was like, it's one of them deals. And of course, we always want your opinion. So at the end, comment for sure, tell me what you think. But here we go. So we're gonna start in the early 80s, 1980s, starting up, here we go, early 80s. I am gonna say that coming out of the late 70s into the early 80s, Mercury was probably in control. Mercury had the good running machine. Now, when I'm saying that, you gotta think that you're in the 80s. It's not what we're dealing with today. Now it's like that's all garbage, but I get that. But if we're just in 1980 right now, I'm going to buy a brand new motor. I got a Johnson sitting here, or I got an Evinrude, an OMC motor sitting here, and I got a Mercury sitting here. I think the more quality engine is gonna be your Mercury in the early 80s. Now, and that trickled all the way into probably their 40, 50 horse, their classic 50s. I don't think that horsepower wise, I believe Mercury's probably blowing them out of the water. And when it comes to then you trickle into the mid 80s, now this is where the battle kind of switches, because I think Evinrude or OMC at the time was releasing a great product. I think they were really, it was a consistent product because that late 84, 85, carbureted, going kind of starting to switch some ignition around, making some more horsepower, releasing into the 88-ish, you end up with that two-cylinder 40-horse, 4050, that was a beast of a machine for Evinrude and OMC. And Mercury just kind of stuck with their same technology, the switch box technology, the wires everywhere, the delaminating wires, shit that falls apart, excuse my French. And then we get into the end of the 80s, 88, 89, and Evinrude still, OMC still plugging. They're still winning, I feel. That, so we started Merc then just kind of plummeted into the mid 80s, I felt, kind of was low. And then we kept OMC just trucking into the late 80s, going into the 90s. And you still saw the Mercury with the tin-headed, hard to work on carburetors that leaked, still going with the 4-cylinder, 2-carburetor style 40 horse, and Evinrude's improving. They're improving ignition, they're improving not points, we're going to power packs, we're going to coils, we're going to making our ignition cleaner, our fuel's better, the carburetors were better, they were starting to be built better. So they're still building a better motor coming into the early 90s. Mercury's still trailing into the early 90s. And when it comes to big horsepower, like back then 150, and even if you look at some of that old race stuff into the 80s, it was Evinrude. Evinrude had that big V8, which I hate. Big V8, you gotta hate it. And then they had the big V6, and they had the XP, and then they had the GT, get tools type thing. But it was still a quality motor for that time frame, for when we're sitting there. Mercury's, you look at the 150s of the early or late 80s into the 90s, and they're not really doing much. Then we get to like 92. Mercury's starting to push here now. Mercury's saying, all right, we got to start doing some stuff. We got to make some changes. 91, I think. Pretty sure it was 91, 92, they started to make some changes. They started making some changes to their power heads. They started to make some changes cowling wise. They got rid of the tin head crap, throw that in a beer can replacement program, and went with started to get some fiberglass stuff in there, started to get modernized, starting to make it look like more of an outboard. And their technology started to come around. I think their gear cases were starting to get a little bit better, but we're still probably not beating Evinrude or OMC. They're still ahead, but they're climbing against them. Big horsepower wise, I would say Evinrude is still in control, OMC. 93, 92, late 90, it's either late 92 or 93, Evinrude releases the Intruder. Now the Evinrude Intruder was, or the Johnson Fast Strike, was a machine, okay? It was a machine from the get-go. I remember a guy here bought one, and he bought it from a company on Southside Marine, it was called, and he had some issues with it. And they came down and they put a brand new motor on it, took them out for break-in, and the guy that was one of the designers on that crew came down and he said, well, this is how you break this thing in. He backed it off the trailer and he just canned it. He goes, that's how you break this motor in. He canned it right down the middle of the Mississippi, and he broke that motor in. And that motor today is still running, and it is over in Minnesota today. It's on a Champion bass boat. It is still running today. That same motor, not had anything done to it but a VRO, of course, power pack, the normal stuff. But that motor kept them ahead of Mercury during that time. That motor actually took that 150, 175 number and shot them up, because all them Hydrosports, which was owned by OMC at the time, Stratuses, were all being powered with that Intruder or that Fast Strike. Every bass boat that was affordable was being powered with that stuff. So they had that market because the bass boat market was all that Intruder stuff. Guys were running that Mercury stuff, but it just didn't perform like that Intruder and that Fast Strike did. The whole shot was great, the top end performance was good, and then you had the idle down feature. So we fire, you get the advance, whoa, and then it just sits there and idles. Doesn't spit, doesn't sputter, doesn't choke out. You put it in gear, I mean, it was smooth operating compared to the XP. So they made the brand change. I mean, they made the change again to advance their technology while Mercury was just settling in here. And then we get to about 98, I'm gonna go to now. So I'm saying that Mercury is still behind all the way up till probably 98, 99. Mercury releases the Optimax. Fuel economy Optimax in the late 90s. And Mercury goes from being like this to going just like this. They start to take off. They start to take off, and I would say they competed right up with that. And then they start to get to introduce, I believe, now I could be wrong because it's hot, my mind's not thinking correctly, but I'm thinking it's either 99, 2000, we maybe, I can't take it for sure, but I think the 4-stroke comes in there for Mercury. Mercury tries to run at the 4-stroke technology, and it's carbureted and it's junk. It idles great, starts okay right now, and it doesn't have the horsepower. But the Optimax, the 2-stroke Optimax, the original 98, 99, the ones that ran for 800 to 1,000 hours and then lost bearings on the crankshaft, that motor, I think, is what started to propel Mercury to take off. Because the next era, which we're going to get into another one, is when the Optimax goes and OMC has problems and they got to try to get the fuel thing under control. Because we all know that the Intruder likes to drink gas like right down the old tube. But so in the late 90s, Mercury's got the Optimax fuel economy. They're starting to take off. Bass boat people are loving it. We still got horsepower. We still got on-plane performance. We got the torque, and we're getting fuel economy. And Evinrude is stuck. They're literally stuck. What are we gonna do? And when we get into 2000, you know what's gonna come. It's the death of OMC. And we're gonna get into that, but we're gonna leave it at that. And when we start talking about 2000, then we're gonna really get the battle of where Mercury, where all this Evinrude stuff and Mercury was going like this through the 80s and 90s, it just, late 90s, it goes just like this. Just like that. I mean, there is a immediate fall and a takeoff that is still today, probably in my eyes, the biggest outboard takeoff that I've ever witnessed is the late 90s into 2000. And that was done by Mercury Marine. So to recap, we start this in the 80s. We've got Evinrude or OMC on top. We've got Mercury battling, but we got to climb in the 90s that Evinrude's taking off. They're going up. Mercury's just sitting here doing this stuff. So Evinrude's taking off in the late 90s, in the mid 90s, and then we get to the late 90s and it just goes opposite. Evinrude's here and it just plummets. So the battle was an intense battle because Evinrude was making the changes, they were making the technology, they were doing the right things. Mercury, I think, in my eyes, and I don't know because I don't have that background of over in Fond du Lac of what's going on, but I think they knew when they wanted to do the release, they had the technology, they had it built, they knew what they wanted to do, and when they went for the attack, it was like Ulysses S. Grant going to a battle. I'm going to win, and that's what they did. They went in swinging, and they said, this is it. This is the new machine. Here it is. Boom, here we go. But in their smaller motors, it's still a battle in the smaller motors in the late 90s. Smaller horsepower, Evinrude, because I'm thinking that 4-stroke's introduced in that era, and it just doesn't work. And the only reason I'm saying that because I picture the cowling of the 98, 99, 225 or 200 or 150 Mercury Optimax, and it's got the guy's face on the side, and I know they released that 4-stroke in that same logo style. So that's why I'm thinking that they tried to introduce that 4-stroke on the back side of that, and people bought them, people liked them, but they just didn't perform the way they needed to. But we know what happens in the 2000s, and it's interesting how it comes around, that it goes from this to this. It's pretty cool. So recap, like I said before, early 80s, Evinrude Johnson. All the way through the 80s, Evinrude Johnson. Into the early 90s, Evinrude Johnson. Mid 90s, Evinrude Johnson. Late 90s, Mercury just takes off. And I believe to this day that Mercury knew what they were doing. They were comfortable with where they were. They were comfortable with the ride they were on, because they weren't changing nothing. They weren't changing the switch box. They weren't changing the ignition. They weren't changing the coils. They were, you know, they introduced the EFI to compete with that Optimax. That EFI was a pretty bad motor also. So small horsepower, you get that. But Mercury's EFI 98, see, that's at 96 EFI. Mercury was a pretty bad motor though. So they were trying to creep up. It was probably like this. I'm gonna say that. 95, 96, big horsepower. It's like this, going just like this. Maybe a little bit of edge to Mercury just because of the EFI technology, and Evinrude stuck in that carbureted technology. And Mercury's got that going on. So I think it's in the late 90s, we got a battle that they're swinging. It's Mike Tyson, Vander Holyfield, just exchanging blows, just beating the crap out of each other. But in that 98, when that Optimax was released and that EFI started to go away, that thing took off. But that EFI technology, 95, 96, was good. But that intruder was pretty bad. It was pretty bad, you know. But switchbox problems, I know there was a crap ton out there because I was working, and when the switchbox problem happened, so you got a wing of ones that are 4, 5, 6 years old, and the switchboxes are failing, and there's not enough, or the power packs were failing. There was not enough power packs in the country. There was none. We had so many power pack motors down after they were like 5 or 6 years old that we had boats that were in the shop that were lined up that didn't have it, and we had a borrow. We had 2 borrow power packs that we owned. So we'd put them on the motors and they'd go use them until their power packs got here. Then we'd take the borrowed ones off and move it down to the next 2. That's how we were getting these guys back out on the water. But like I said, when the EFI technology came, it was good. It was the competition to the intruder, and it was a swing fest from the intruder and the EFI, the XR motor and the EFI motor, late 90s, mid 90s. It was a swing fest. It was a swing fest. It was a battle. We saw a lot of it. We saw more Evinrudes in Wisconsin than I saw Mercury's over here. I believe there was a lot of that going on. So, but the small motor thing, I still think Evinrude took it. It took it in the 80s and the 90s. I think the small motors were definitely there. But when you get to big horsepower, 150 and up, I think it was a swing fest in the mid 90s to late 90s when Mercury took over. All right, so what I want you to do is I want you to comment on possibly another brand battle, possibly like maybe a Japanese build battle, something like that if you want to see that. Also, I want you to comment on the 80s and the 90s on what your thoughts are. I want to hear what your thoughts are. Remember, these are just my thoughts. That's what I saw in the shop here when I was servicing. I want to hear from you guys. I want to hear from other people. Well, I think Evinrude was crap during that time. That's cool. I want to hear that. I want you to comment. I want you to say, yeah, well, I had one of these, it was junk. Perfect. That's what we want to hear, because we want to engage. We want to engage with you guys, and we want you guys to engage with each other. And always stay tuned for the Evinrude, Mercury, OMC, bye-bye, Mercury battle from 2000 to present. Stay tuned for all that. And as always, comment, subscribe, click the notification bell to witness the madness that I personally call speed, money, and no brakes.